This screencast is made following the mock exams that Year 11 sat in the autumn for their IGCSE. Most of the comments relate either to the CIE English Literature course or to the edXL IGCSE English Language Paper 1. The comments are intended to be fairly generic and therefore useful for anybody who cares to listen, though students of ours at John Lyon will, I think, recognise some of their errors and common misthinkings, for want of a better word, as we read through this screencast. So, what I want to draw attention to start off with is where we're going to go in this piece of work. We're going to look at common errors, potentially to do with reading instructions. Now, in this case, this is not going to be so much of an issue in the summer. CIE have changed the prescription for the English Lit exams, and there will no longer be the requirement to do one passage based, one whole text, and so on in answering. But that doesn't mean to say that the instructions are not relevant. Time should be given to read the rubric on the front of the paper. To fall foul of rubric is to throw marks away. It is as much an issue at IGCSE as it is at A-level, and I urge you to do it. I'll talk about planning in a minute and how you might use that all-important first paragraph. And also remind you, I hope, about paragraphs having essentially a topic question linked to the technique. The PBQs are passage-based questions, WTQs are writer's technique questions. Then use an actual example. Don't just repeat what you've said in the introductory paragraph. Develop your thinking as you go through, and this will happen if you've planned. Make sure you understand the difference between connotation and denotation. Get used to using reference. Certainly chapter, certainly act or scene in a play. Page, less often, possibly, simply because of the amount of different editions there are of texts. Although if you know the page references, very often for a quotation, it will really help you organise your thoughts, because you will, therefore, be able to contextualise the event you are discussing within the structure of the novel. Likewise, line references, I'm not so sure, are vital, particularly in Shakespeare, where different editions line in different ways. But my comment about context still holds. For a lot of you reading this who are about to sit exams, this last comment about writing, it does matter. Now, if you're taught by me, you know that I have indecipherable handwriting. And the very fact that you from time to time have occasions to say, "Excuse me, Mr. Peel, what does this say?" should alert you to the problem of this. I'm not sitting exams, I'm generally writing feedback, and I'm very happy to come and explain what I've said because it enables me to spend a bit more time with you discussing in more detail what I've written. That's not the reason I have bad handwriting. I have bad handwriting because I have bad handwriting. But many of you are so unused to writing by hand for any length of time that your handwriting has become almost illegible. Whilst there is not a mark to be lost for handwriting per se, it stands to reason that if your argument is not clear, because key elements of it can't be understood on the page, you cannot expect to get the highest levels. Very quickly at the end, there are a few more common errors, just ones to think about. Perhaps they're less common than the ones above, and there's a little checklist at the end of the screencast. You can see these, so as I leave you to read those, I'll move on. Let's look at these first ones first. Read the instructions, I mean that's a given. But then write a plan. And I recommend, particularly in English Lit, that you're using SLIME and SCSI, other forms of planning if you have them, to help you to organise what you're going to write. Both SLIME and SCSI are good because they let you develop a 5-paragraph essay simply by relating to them. They also make you think about what it is you're going to be discussing rather than thinking in terms of these are the 3 passages I know, I will stick them on the piece of paper, whatever. Trappers, my favourite mnemonic for creative writing. A forest, which I know a lot of you are using. Help you to write better creative tasks, but don't be afraid to recognise them being used by the writers you analyse. This should help you spot techniques being used that can therefore be discussed. Now, if you take some time writing, if you take some time thinking rather before you write, your writing will engage in clarity. From the moment you open the exam paper and read the question, you need to be thinking about your response. You should also read each question. If you've been asked to do a choice, make sure you make a sensible choice by reading all the questions. And then, yes, in your opening paragraph, you can reflect the question. Don't just rewrite it. Start straight away to answer the question. We can see here an example. What striking impressions of the narrator does Saif create for you? Saif creates a striking impression of the narrator. They're echoing the question. As much as anything else, it allows the examiner to clue in immediately as to which one he's marking, or she, by using the following main techniques, which make us feel and possibly moving on. One technique is to use powerful metaphors, such as, and then quote one. The point about all this is that in that first paragraph, that first sentence even, yes, list some techniques by all means, but only if you are going to go on to establish a reason for using them. Simply to list techniques is pointless. Of course they use literary techniques, but what is the purpose of these techniques? Think about that, and from the beginning show the examiner that you are somebody who is here to analyse the effect of the devices, rather than to list the 5 things that your teacher told you to remember. That's the difference between C grades and A grades. You may do all of this without using quotes at the start, but just don't start writing until you've thought about what your points are actually going to be as you write. For each point, each paragraph should start with a topic sentence. This is in essence the point of a PEE, PEARL, PQE, whatever you want to call it, piece of writing. Don't just write exactly the same as you wrote in the introductory paragraph. Develop it beyond. As I said before, start to use certainly chapter, act, scene references. Start to be aware of the need to contextualise, particularly in the passage questions, very briefly, to show that you understand where this passage comes in the text. There is another PowerPoint and screencast about this on my blog. Do please look at it. And obviously, reiterating there the need for clarity in handwriting. Now, one of the problems with a lot of the writing that was read this year is that it's very long-winded to not much purpose. So here's a little question, or rather a response from a question on All My Sons. She asks Anne, talking about the mother here, she asks Anne, you gained a little weight, didn't you, darling? This is intended to make Chris think she's unappealing. The rhetorical question, didn't you, in conjunction with darling, makes it seem as if mother is trying to be subtle and nice, whilst criticising Anne. Now think about this. I mean, yes, you've thrown some technical language into this paragraph. But actually you've added absolutely nothing. That this is intended is completely irrelevant when you think about this. And often simplicity and clarity is the way forward. Yes, it's a question, although I would hazard that it isn't a rhetorical question, because it is being directed at Anne with an intention that Anne might well want to answer it. And you might want to talk about darling, but if you were going to talk about darling, surely you would talk about the insincerity of using darling between these two, who so obviously dislike each other so much, and perhaps use it to develop something to do with the mother's sort of almost hypocritical stance towards Anne at this point. What you're adding is nothing whatsoever by saying it's a question and saying in conjunction with darling when mother is trying to be subtle. That is evident from your explanation and the choice of the quotation. Another huge issue that many of you suffered from this year is this obsession with telling us what part of speech is being used. Firstly, very often a lot of you actually get it wrong. And I can think of little that is more likely to lose you the sympathy of an examiner than an obsession with telling him or her that an adverb implies such and such and such and such, when in fact what we're looking at is a noun, or an adjective, or a verb. But also, a single comment about an adverb isn't really enough. Look at it in relation to patterning. Is this a passage where somebody uses a great deal of adverbs, adjectives? Is the writer using adverbs and adjectives deliberately and consistently throughout the passage for effect? If so, focus on that, rather than simply trying to show off that you know that a certain word is an adverb or an adjective. I think this, which will link with at least one point as we go on, comes from a wish to impress the examiner with your knowledge of sort of English terminology, and all I would say is that I don't believe that it does. The risk of getting it wrong greatly outweighs the possible and I think negligible benefit of using the term in the first place. A lot of you are writing and showing in your writing a weakness of it with English language itself. Irregular past participles, when you're turning verbs into past. These are some of the examples. Shined instead of shone, teared instead of tore. The hyphen is a little less of a problem. I think one's being a little bit of a pedant, and I'm sure Dr. Mello will forgive me for that. But actually, you may as well begin to learn these things. Hyphens link things together, known as the en dash. They link ideas together in terms of compounds. They don't require space. The whole point is that they're joining pieces of punctuation. The em dash, the longer dash as opposed to a hyphen, is doing the opposite. It is actually separating because it is trying to add information, and so it needs us to remove ourselves, and that does have space around it. Again, you might think it's a small point, but I would argue clarity in something like that is far more use to you, particularly if you're somebody who's typing work as you get older, than an obsession with the use of what we'll come to in a moment, which is lexical choice. But I'll leave that one just whilst we clear up some others here now. Now, I know you can read, so I'm happy to let you. If something denotes something, it's what it means. If something connotes something or has a connotation, then it's providing a clue to the subtext. It might be being implied or suggested. And very often these two are treated as interchangeable. Now, this is a problem. For example, in a example here from a student, in the phrase kick in the teeth, kick denotes violence. Well, actually, no, it doesn't denote violence. All it actually denotes is a vigorous movement of the leg, presumably from the knee joint downwards, flicking the leg forward. I don't know. I don't know how you describe it, but that's what it means. Thus, I don't believe that there is violence if somebody kicks a football. If somebody kicks something else, yes, there might be. So the connotation of violence, yes, I would probably accept that. But not denotation. That is simply wrong. So you could point out in something of this nature that this is part of a wider discussion about the anger being shown by the speaker. Yes, the speaker is right to be angry, but the imagery perhaps so savage that the audience might question the motives of the speaker. And you can start to bring in your connotations. You're also beginning to show that you're aware that there might be different interpretations if you're writing in this way. You might also begin to say that this, in turn, this idea that might be that the imagery is excessively savage, might anticipate the revenge going wrong and tie into some awareness of structure in the piece that you are working on. Implies and infers, another pair that are often misused. To imply something is we imply through what is said or what happens, and the reader infers ideas from what is implied. The writer implies, the reader infers. Now, to imply also suggests that there is a subtlety about it, that it's something that's hidden. And very often, it's being misused again in this way. The word, if you just want to say the writer is telling me something, if you want a slightly sort of higher value word, of course, is indicates rather than implies. The examiner will want to see that you can detect subtext, that you can explore nuance, in essence, that you can infer. But the examiner is not interested in seeing that you understand on a simple level, simple words, basic words being used throughout the exam. Yes, you might want to flag them up if they're an important part of a vocabulary. You might want to flag them up if in some way they indicate the character of the speaker, and the obvious one here might be Keller's use of brooch, and that mispronunciation of brooch, which is such a lovely moment of anger and tension and, well, comedy actually, in the second act of All My Sons. But, again, rather as we've said before, don't waste time explaining what is obvious. You gain your credit for looking at what lies beneath. Now, I mentioned lexical choice a little while ago, and I think this is something that I don't know whether this is something that is particular to students at John Lyon or whether it's something that people have around the place. But again, I think it's something that comes from a wish to show off. Put it like this: if I felt that there was a chance that an examiner was going to give you a higher mark because you commented on the lexical choice as opposed to the word used, then I think I would have two things. I think the first thing I'd do is probably leave teaching. And the second thing I'd do is want to go meet those examiners around the back of a bike shop and have a quiet word with them about really what they are trying to get out of students. The point is, a lexical choice just means a choice from a lexicon, i.e. a dictionary. In other words, a word. And most of the words that you seem to think are given weight and interest by being a lexical choice. You can't see my fingers doing the speech marks, I apologise. Are just simply words that have been chosen. They're words. Now, there might be a reason for the choice of that word, and in any examination, you will get your credit for discussing why words have been chosen. You will not get the credit for simply calling them a lexical choice. What do they do? Are they part of a metaphor? Are they alliterative? Are they onomatopoeic? Is it speech? Do they form a pattern because they share connotations with other words? It's not that lexical choice as such is not worth commenting upon, but why distract yourself from the business of the analysis by taking such care to label a word as being a lexical choice? It's a word. Clarity, please. Another area that you do have problems with is the use of semantic field. Now, if a semantic field is a general grouping of words with a shared meaning or set of association, we're happy. They're relevant when a writer repeatedly chooses words that share connotations to build up a distinct image. And there's a quotation here from Sassoon that you can read and then read the comment underneath it. Because the point about this isn't that uniting the flares and shell bursts and destruction of church spires within a single semantic field, their significance is accentuated, because that again is actually not adding a great deal to the writing here. What is making the point is the discussion of the sights and sounds of battle referring to a dragon, and then making it sound evil and furious. And you could use words within that to comment far more interestingly on why the fires might be darting, for example. Take a specific word, go for it. Why the coils are grappling. That's a wonderfully powerful verb. Again, why has it been chosen? Start to work with the key words. An example from a student this year, she describes the floor as golden and gleaming, which has a semantic field of beauty and perfection. And the point here that I want to make is that quite apart from the poor grammar of this response, it's much, much too vague. Golden and gleaming do not belong to a single semantic field. They could just as easily belong to treasure, wealth, value, worth, as beauty and perfection. This writer has reduced the effectiveness of his analysis by taking, I would argue, an easy way out by referring to the semantic field rather than looking at the words themselves and working his way through the connotations of those words. Now, there are one or two bits of language, just quickly as we get towards the end of the screencast, to be thinking about. If the writer states or asserts, we have to remember that we are referring to a strong opinion. This is a strong idea if we're stating it or asserting it. To represent something is a really strong verb to use when discussing decoding a symbol or a metaphor within the text. Use shows at a lower level when perhaps you're going to summarise what a text is about, its themes, its moral. Use describes, again on a more general level, when you're looking about, well, a discussion that in detail, but not necessarily any explanation or analysis. Portrays is a great word to use when one's working in depth of description. Depicts is less fancy, it's less descriptive. Steinbeck portrays Slim when he first appears in the most grandiloquent of manners, for those of you who remember Of Mice and Men. I don't think he would depict him, and I certainly don't think he would simply be enough to say he describes him. Refers, looking at referencing together, something that reminds us of something else. And relates is not the same as refers, because it's to do with explaining how an event is connected to an earlier or later event. Alludes is a gentle reference to an exterior text. You could argue that it's actually a good verb to use when talking about intertextuality in that way. Implies and infers, we've talked about already. Suggests, hints, intimate are subtle, and therefore this is only to be used when you are suggesting an idea that you have identified in something that is not explicit. This is a good verb, or these are good verbs rather, to use to show that you get subtext. If we can assume or suppose, it means that we are confident, but not stating what we are saying as fact. And again, this might be a way into suggesting alternative views. Speculate that is something that you might wish to use more perhaps when writing about unseens. It's a nice way, a stylish way of saying that you've guessed what the writer's intentions are. We've talked about denotation and connotation already. Now, you can all read. And what I suggest you do in a moment is pause the screencast when I've finished. And whether in your mock examination scripts, if you're one of my students, or in any previous work, if you're reading this, listening to this from outside, go back into your texts, go back into your work, and just start to think about how you can set yourself useful targets to improve your writing. Thank you very much for listening. This will be the last one before Christmas that I put up. Good luck.